Hi, my name is Abigail Carroll, and I am going to talk about the A&E lesson, which is over the War of 1812, the cause and effects, with some of the differentiation that's involved. So for mine, 5.4 history TEK is so broad. The TEK is students understand political, economic, and social changes that occur in the United States during the 19th century. Okay, so that's a really large TEK. So I broke it up into days. So, my first day would be that the student understands the political and economic changes. So for that, I would make my day and have I would create a PowerPoint so that the visually impaired would have something to look at. And so with that, I would be lecturing with a PowerPoint on the board, and I would have some guided notes that had the key terms and the key vocabulary on them. So when I'm working on the key vocabulary, some of the terms I would use were the Orders in Council, which was an act that allowed the Prime Minister of Great Britain to pass laws and allowed Great Britain to fight against Napoleon Bonaparte in Europe. For political, another term I would use was the Embargo Act, which was a general embargo on all foreign nations enacted by the United States Congress against Great Britain and France during the Napoleonic Wars. I wrote down some notes in an outline. Oh, you can't really see it, but for this project, so that's what I'm looking at. Another major act I would really stress for these students is the Non-Intercourse Act, which lifted all embargoes on American shipping except for those bound for British and French ports. So for intermediate ELLs, a lot of them struggle with new vocab words, new being able to use the new words and new phrases in common speech. And so because of that, I would use a Chromebook. And on the Chromebook, there's a really cool site that creates timelines. And so to try to get all these acts and all these political factors involved because of the wars, 1812 has more than what people remember going on about it. I would want to go through and talk about how each of those acts and each of those things had an effect on one another. So for an example, the Embargo Act, the Non-Intercourse Act, and the Orders of Council aren't just separate entities. They all affected one another in history. So because of that, I would want them to work in groups, probably tabletop groups or shoulder partners, and create a timeline and explain on the timeline how it's important. How it's important for each of those events to happen in the order in which they happened, for the War of 1812 to have happened the way it happened. I will explain the main causes of the War of 1812 and how the events impacted the start of the war. I will also explain and define the vocabulary words listed and what I just said. So some of the main causes that we'll go over is how the War of 1812 came after the American Revolutionary War, and while that might sound boring or plain, it had a major impact on the outcome of the war. So on my PowerPoint, which on my computer, what I wrote down, and these are I used throughout a PowerPoint, but I also put photos. So my ESL, my sight impaired, and even my auditory impaired, because a lot of times with auditory impairment, they might be able to read or see and hear, they have all their senses, but the comprehension isn't there. So because of that, I created guided reading tabs that I will add to my attached document when I turn in my essay. And the attached document has the vocab words and the explained definitions, and they will also have access to the PowerPoints on their Google Classroom. So while they're sitting there and the comprehension might not be there, they can see it on the board. They'll be able to have their Google Chromebooks out, and they'll be able to see and have extra time on it and be able to have access to it when they're doing their guided lessons and other things. They'll be able to have that comprehension kind of built in and as a support system. Okay, so my PowerPoint says in 1812, Russia tried to mediate between warring cousins, which are Great Britain and the United States of America. And hopefully throughout this, before this, I would have explained why, because of the Revolutionary War, why they were warring and the impacts that that had on American politics. Okay, so they were warring and because of that, they were putting pressure on Great Britain to recognize America's right to citizenship, state the liberty of trade on its own land and by seas and beyond within its own shores, thus leading to the War of Independence between Great Britain and the United States. Okay, so the aims of that war, this would be review from the section that hopefully we would have just covered. Okay, so the aims of that were to solve unsolved issues from the American Revolutionary War, to solve issues of trade, maritime freedom on the oceans, and for the United States Merchant Navy, to put a pressure on Great Britain to stop its practice of forced imprisonment on the American merchant sailors in the Royal Navy. 4. To recognize the citizenship rights of the Americas. And 5. To end the Royal Navy's practice of raiding American coastal cities, taverns, bars, pubs, and ale houses on the East Coast and impressing able-bodied men into the Royal Navy or hang them if they tried to desert. So at this point, the students would be aware that at this time in history, Great Britain had the best, strongest, whatever, navy in the world. Like, that's already known. So the issue for them is to understand the vocab term impressment and what that means. So for this, after we have done a review, I would go through and ask them on it'd be like kind of a bell ringer, but not really. It's just like a small assessment within the review before we get to the new material. So I would ask them to go over, what impressment is. And then I'll go over, what it means, the vocab. And so the assessment I would do is there a synonym or is there a similar word that we use today that can mean a similar thing to impressment? So that would be like going to jail, prison, any of those terms where you lose your rights or you don't, have that able body, that's what it would be. So I'd give them like 5-10 minutes. I would walk around the room, make sure they're all on task. If they have questions, they can ask them. And then after they would do it, maybe about 5 minutes, go around the room and have some people share, the ones who had like really strong ones and could explain why, have them talk and have the auditory people go through and listen and write down what other people said while having the sight impaired having a doc open on the PowerPoint and going through and write down the new vocabulary words that the new students have said. Okay, so after that I would continue with the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint says, sadly, Russia wasn't able to achieve much because of the Lord Liverpool's refusal and game plan to Napoleon. France and Spain were deemed out of the way, so Britain could attack New Orleans and Florida. So at this point, there's a United States map, and there's a star on New Orleans and a star on Florida, so they can understand the distance between the two cities and have a visual representation of the rivers, so they can understand why those two were really important because of like where they were located to riverways and other stuff. Okay, so the plan and the attack failed, thus accumulating the Treaty of Ghent, 1814, of British intrigue with all issues were abandoned, refusal to be addressed in Russian terms, but things were allowed to return to what they were before. Meaning, so this would be a whole nother slide, and this would be what I would highlight and ask my students to know. The creation of free Indian buffer zone between Ohio and Wisconsin, as demanded by the British, was no longer an issue. It was abandoned. It was done. Britain no longer wanted part of that. That was the United States land. It was over. 2. The northeastern territories gained during the war by the British was returned back to the United States. So all the war they might have gained earlier was gone. It's United States land. They're leaving. They're out. Okay, that was the second. Okay, the third. All freed slaves conscripted by the Royal Navy by the British were paid for, made by British subjects, and were not returned to America. Which means on the Royal Navy that was located on maybe on the coastlines of America, when they came home to Great Britain if they were paid for and they were sold to the Navy, and that was the Navy's property, that they were no longer allowed back into the Americas. They were citizens of Great Britain, and that's where they went home to. A little more, it says, Napoleon escaped 2 days after the treaty. Further ascents tried down to the continent, allowing Jackson claim of New Orleans and Florida. We knew that. British was upset by the play and disregarded to human or American lives lost at Fort Henry, Baltimore, and the burning of Washington and many other wars of the American Revolution. The Russian Tsar then told Alaska and the United States. That created a buffer zone, placing Americas between Russian and the British and Canada. So at this point, again, there would be a map explaining, here's America, here's Russia, and here's other continents. And this is where it gets tricky because we're like sandwiched in between other major powers around the world. Okay. So the TEAC 5.4, the students understand political, economic, and social changes that occurred in the United States during the 19th century. So the War of 1812 wasn't just over land or political issues. It had a much broader effect. And if you look at it, the effects go exactly with the TEAC. Political. We're fighting not only now for independence, but for the right of our own country. So the students are able to look at maps, and this is what in the guided reading they'll have maps that they'll be able to fill out. They'll have a map and they'll understand, okay, why were these port cities important to Britain to take, and why is it important to us now? Okay, move on. Why is it important that we were sandwiched between two major countries, and why did it make a statement when Britain left the United States and they didn't just sell their land, they gave it up. They left. Okay, that's another factor. Okay, political. The War of 1812 created, we already had political parties, but it backed up the presidents that were already in power. It backed up their beliefs, and it made them these strong historic figures in history. It created a sense of, presidents know best, and they have us, and this is, the War of 1812 was a huge backbone in that. So after we go through the vote, I'm going to ask them to create another timeline. But this timeline's cool because this is a Monday lecture, and on Friday I'm going to have to ask them to create another timeline. And a lot of this was just because I got excited, and I know it's only a 15-minute video, but so this one is going to have, up until now, they know some battles. Hold on one second. Yeah. They know the Battle of Plattsburgh, which was an American victory. They know the Battle of, Bladensburg, or the burning of Washington, which was a British victory. They know the Battle of Lake Erie, which was an American victory. They know the Battle of New Orleans, which was an American victory. And they know the Battle of Baltimore, which was an American victory because the British left. Great. Perfect. But from that information, I want them to predict. Okay, so we know why the war started. We know the political statement, we know the political climate, we know the economic climate, and we know what social issues, slavery, land ownership, all these things, where am I a citizen to? All these things are major influences on the War of 1812. Okay, so now with all that we know so far, we don't know really, we know some major figures, but not a lot. We know some of the major battles, and we know who won, and that's about it. We maybe know where they're located. We don't know at this point how the war truly turns out. So I'd ask them to create a timeline of what they know now, and then on Friday they'll create a timeline of what happens. So this is a prediction. So if okay, maybe we won, but how? How many battles do you think are left? Did the historical figures play a part? I want them to create this guesswork, so when they go through on Friday, they'll have this really cool prediction, and they'll be able to compare oh, this happened because of this, and so they'll be able to draw back from those original guesses that they made on Friday. So my intermediate ELLs will have guided lesson sheets with vocab. My visual impairments will have access to photos and visuals online as long as the slides that I give. My auditory impairment will have access to the slides as well, and they'll also have a read aloud if wanted. And then that lesson plan is a good And this is like, I think, a really good example of the Teague 5.4. Okay.